Well, do keep your Bibles open there to Esther chapter 1. I'm really excited about starting our Esther series this evening as we start here in chapter 1. Esther's possibly, certainly one of my favourite Old Testament books, if not one of my favourite books in the Bible. It's full of drama, it's full of intrigue, and it's full of comedy. But what it's not full of, at first glance, as Pastor Rich has already said, is God. At first glance, it doesn't seem to be full of God. In fact, God is not mentioned by name or referenced at all in the book of Esther. We might think that's pretty weird that a book that doesn't mention God has made it into the Bible. Now, because of this, there have been some who have said that, well, Esther isn't really a religious book. Actually, it's just a Jewish novel that's been written to make the Jewish people feel proud, rather than teaching anything about God or religion. Others haven't quite gone as far as that, but they have suggested that the story of Esther has been censored to take God out of it so that it wouldn't be banned in its day when it was written. But we reject both of those ideas. I reject the idea that the man has any editing privileges over God's word. It hasn't been censored by man. And I reject that just because God isn't mentioned by name, it has nothing to say about God. On the contrary, I believe that God not being mentioned, by that, we are actually being taught something very exciting and relevant about God and how he works through the book of Esther. And I believe that we are being taught this, even when we cannot see the direct intervention of God in our world, nevertheless, he is at work. But before we get to that, before we see that message, let's first consider the context of the book of Esther. The events of Esther take place during the time of the Persian Empire. It's an empire which was considered and is considered perhaps one of the greatest empires ever, certainly of the ancient world. It was huge, it was vast, it was a massive and powerful kingdom. We've seen something of its scope in that first verse as we see that King Ahasuerus reigned from Africa to the borders of India. That's a huge kingdom, it's a massive kingdom, and certainly for its day, his power and resources were seemingly infinite. And living in this mighty kingdom was a community of Jews. We might ask, why are there Jews living in Persia? Why aren't they in Jerusalem, in the Promised Land at least? Well, you see, the Jews had been taken into captivity sometime earlier by the Babylonians. And they'd been kept captive there for 70 years. After that 70 years, some of them returned under the leadership of Zerubbabel, but many stayed in Persia and the surrounding areas. Some would later return with Ezra, and many more still would return later with Nehemiah. But the events of Esther happened between that first return and the second return. And so these Jewish people, they were no longer in captivity. In fact, they weren't the ones who were taken in captivity. These are people who've been born in this land. They weren't in captivity, but they certainly weren't home. And this is important for us to understand if we're going to learn what God is teaching us here. The Jews living in Persia were not like those who lived around them. They knew that their leaders, the Persian leaders, couldn't be trusted. You see, the Persians, they held all the power, and the Jews had none of the power. Even though these Jews had been born in Persia, they were exiles from their homeland. They were surrounded by strangers. Their property could be seized or their life ended on a whim by some petty bureaucrat. On the other hand, things could go well for them. If they were fortunate and things went well for them, if they kept their heads down, they might survive to a good old age. They might make a reasonable living in the land of Persia, in the empire of Persia. But my question is this how the Jewish people should have been thinking? Well, if I'm fortunate I'll be okay. If things just land the right way for me, I'll get through this life. If I just keep my head down, if I don't make too much noise, I'll be okay. Is that how a member of God's covenant community should be thinking? Wasn't there a God in heaven? Wasn't there a God who had committed himself to the Jewish people in an ancient covenant? Didn't he take care of their forefathers when they were in a land that was not their own? Didn't he bring their forefathers out of Egypt with a mighty hand? Wouldn't he look after his people now through this present darkness? Or would he? Would he look after his people? After all, it's been a long time, an awful long time since that wonderful story of crossing the Red Sea. Why would God be bothered with ordinary people seeking to eke out a living in Persia? They couldn't see this God. They hadn't heard from him in a long time. And in any case, they were living a long way from the land that God called his own. Did this invisible God still have what it takes in terms of power and interest to reach out and touch their lives? This is the question the book of Esther seeks to answer. And my question is, given that question, could there be anything more relevant for us as 21st century Christians to grapple with than is God still interested in us when we don't hear or see him work in the ways that he has in the past? We too are strangers in the land in which we live, aren't we? We're called to be in the world, but not of the world. A tiny community in a vast and powerful nation. How will God help us? Because we also struggle with the invisibility of God, don't we? The God who can part the Red Sea and raise Jesus from the dead does not choose to exert that same power in that way in our experience. We don't hear him speaking from a burning bush. We don't walk with him in the garden. We don't see him working miracles in the natural world, accompanied by those words from his chosen prophets. And he doesn't bring people back from the dead. Often we struggle under the weight of the world, and we struggle sometimes to believe that God is there at all. We ask for guidance and he seems silent. We ask for healing and he appears reluctant. We ask for a job or a spouse or health or for salvation for a loved one, and he still appears hidden to us. We find ourselves, like the Jews of Esther's day, desperately trying to keep balance in a confusing world where God's activity seems invisible. And whilst we struggle with the invisibility of God, we have no such problems perceiving the powers of the world, do we? And so, in the face of God's perceived silence and the deafening noise of the world's power, we face two temptations. We face the twin temptations of assimilation and despair. Assimilation, becoming like the world, and despair. For the Jews living in Persia, the power of the pagan empire was intensely visible and tangible to them. They heard the power every day in the marching of the soldiers and the rumble of the chariot wheels. They saw it in the opulent wealth. They smelt it in the incense offered in 100 state-sponsored pagan temples all around them. And it could be overwhelming to them. I don't know if many of you are Star Trek fans. Anybody at all? Yeah, one or two? There's one or two. You're good, okay. Well, if you are, you'll be familiar with the Borg. Some of you may be familiar with that term anyway. The Borg were a collection of bionic drones, and what they would do, they would conquer planets, they would take their resources, they would take what's good from that culture, put it into their hive mind, and they'd take the people from that planet as well, and they'd make them part of this hive mind of alien creatures. And their slogan was, "Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated." That's what they used to say. And in just the same way, the Persian Empire sought to do the same thing. They assimilated everyone from Africa to India into this one culture, everyone to be the same. Every one way of thinking, dictating how everyone shall believe. You shall assimilate. Resistance is futile. And so if assimilation was the temptation of Esther's day, well, let's just become like them. Let's just do what they do. Let's forget our distinctiveness. If assimilation was one temptation, then the other temptation surely was despair. If God is silent, but this very visible danger is loud and noisy and present, why not just give up? Be assimilated into the crowd, become like them. What's the point? God isn't there, he's not listening, he's not doing anything. Resistance seems futile. You see, those who despair, those who give up, those who have given up hope are easily assimilated, are easily made to be one of the culture. But fortunately, the book of Esther offers two answers to the two temptations of assimilation and despair. Two answers that I believe are just as relevant and effective today as they were then. And the first answer to this temptation to assimilate and despair, the first one is to laugh. To laugh. You see, the book of Esther is satirical. It mocks the Persian Empire. It laughs at the power of Ahasuerus. It laughs at his claim to power and authority. You see, satire, it takes the object of something that is fearful and makes fun of it, showing the ridiculous side of this thing that seems so serious and scary, weakening its grip of fear on the mind and the soul by showing really how foolish and weak this thing is that we have feared for so long. Christians, we need to learn to laugh more. And looking at your faces tonight, we could really do with it. We need to learn to laugh more. And the book of Esther is here to help us with that. It's a funny book. It's comedic. Too often we take the world far too seriously. And in doing so, we give it power and we give it weight. And we also take ourselves far too seriously. We need to laugh. We need to mock a little bit. We need to point at something and call it ridiculous when it is ridiculous. You see, the one who is able to laugh in the face of the Borg will never be successfully assimilated. And so satire is a powerful weapon against despair. The book of Esther tears the mask off the world and shows that it's not run by some fearsome giants after all, but by petty bureaucrats who we should laugh at. The second approach to the book of Esther, so look for that as we go through Esther, look for those opportunities to laugh. But the second approach the book of Esther takes is to show us that God is often at work in the world in a completely different way from, say, the events of the Exodus. See, in the Exodus, God's working was all thunder and lightning. It was bold and it was brash and it was obvious. It could be seen and it could be heard. In the book of Esther, however, we see a God that is still at work, only this time it is invisibly and behind the scenes. There are no dramatic miracles. There are no great heroes. Just ordinary people and ordinary providence. God working in ordinary ways, moving flawed and otherwise undistinguishable people into exactly the right place at exactly the right time to bring this empire into line and to establish God's purposes for his people. This is the big message of Esther. God at work in the ordinary. I feel ordinary. I think most of us here feel ordinary. Our lives seem mundane and ordinary, but God tells us even in the small things, he is at work, in the everyday. And just because we may not see it, doesn't mean he isn't at work. It's also a caution against the desire for signs and miracles and the big things that we think have to be there for God to be at work. It's a caution against believing that God can only work in one way. And I believe that the way God works in Esther is the way he works today. So there's a lot here for us to learn. Having set up the context and the theme of Esther, let's get into chapter 1 and just see some of the things that are going on there. The book of Esther begins by introducing us to the great empire of James, how do we say it again? Ahasuerus, thank you. To the great kingdom of Ahasuerus. I'm going to refer to him as the king probably at some point going forward. By any earthly measure, it is an impressive rule, isn't it? He's an impressive ruler. 127 provinces, a kingdom that stretches from Africa to India. Now, in this time, there's no motorization, there's no flight, there's no weapons of mass destruction. That's quite an impressive feat, particularly for the day. That is some power this guy wields. And Ahasuerus, he knew how to throw a party, right? He's a party guy. A six-month-long party. Anyone who was anyone was there, and there were marble pillars and hangings of white and violet linen in the gardens, and even the floor they walked on was a mosaic of costly materials. Their couches were made of gold and silver. Actually reminds me of the things that certainly what Jake makes in Minecraft. These couches of gold and silver. But you see, this detail that we're given here in this opening bit of the chapter, it isn't just filler. It isn't just colour. It isn't just a bit of the story to bring us in. This lengthy description serves an important purpose in setting up this story and what's going to happen. See, as we read this, we're meant to be simultaneously impressed and also slightly revolted by the excess and the wastefulness of the king. Ahasuerus is the very picture of power and wealth. He's impressive. But very quickly, the image of a capable, powerful, important leader begins to become unraveled. And we see that although Ahasuerus seems extravagant and generous with his power, putting on this party for the people, including 7 days for anybody who would come, he seems powerful and he seems generous. But look at verse 8. And drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. The king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. So we see here a continuation of the theme of Ahasuerus' power, sure, but doesn't it at the same time show the ridiculousness of his power? Even the drinking in his party had to conform to a law. Sounds like a party guy, right? No detail escaped the empire's notice or regulation. I mean, an edict was required so that no one was under compulsion. An instruction was needed for everyone to know they were free. It's ridiculous. He's obviously a bit of a tyrant, that nobody felt they could just drink freely at a party unless they'd been told by the king there was a law that you're allowed to. You see, this isn't a display of power, but of petty bureaucracy. The tendency to micromanage and to regulate such tiny details is actually a sign of weakness and insecurity, not power. Hearing the king's generous edict that no one is under compulsion should cause us to chuckle a little bit. And it shows us the first little chink in his armour. But this little chink very quickly shows itself to be a growing crack. Because the destruction of the empire continues in the next scene. The deconstruction of the empire continues. The great king has been drinking for 7 days straight. I think we can assume he's in fairly high spirits. And so he sends 7 of his eunuchs to summon his queen, so that the people at the party could admire her beauty. But to command the queen to appear dressed in all her royal finery for the enjoyment of a crowd of drunken men? Oh, he's treating her more like a doll, like a plaything, like an object that existed for his own pleasure. She was a trophy wife. For Queen Vashti, the edict, no compulsion, evidently didn't comply. She was under compulsion. And here we see the dark side of placing so much power in the hands of a man whose only thought is for himself. But here, the king's raw power hit a snag. Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Sure, that's got nothing to do with the 7 days of drinking. You see, what we observe here is that the law of the Medes and the Persians could not be revoked, but it turns out it could be refused. The law might be able to compel you to drink as you wished, but apparently it was not ultimately able to compel the king's wife to be treated that way. A mere woman, that's not me speaking, but that was the way she would have been viewed. A mere woman in that context stood up to the king and said no. And the empire was powerless to enforce its will. A man whose power is so great that he can command an empire was unable to command his wife. And so what was to be done with this dangerous threat to authority? The king's advisors are terrified that the queen's just say no policy would spread to every home in the empire. The horror. What would happen to man's position in the home if it could be known that the queen herself had refused to obey even the king? So, as all men who are drunk on power and alcohol do, they concocted a sensible and measured plan to deal with this dangerous threat to the empire. I have a brilliant idea, my lord. Let's make a new law that the beautiful Queen Vashti can never be seen by you again. And let's give her position to someone else. And then, let's make sure we tell everyone what happened. I mean, come on. Brilliant, says the king. Let's do that. I don't know why you had a Glaswegian accent then, but there we go. It's a ridiculous story, isn't it? It's a ridiculous idea. We're meant to laugh as these gaggle of drunken men come up with a good idea to deal with the queen. You see, first of all, we see this law doesn't actually deal with the problem at all, does it? Queen Vashti didn't obey and come when I called. Well, now she can never come. It's a law there to cover the fact that he can't get his wife to do what she's told. It's like me opening the back door and calling the kids in from the garden. Kids, it's tea time. No, we want to play some more. Now, instead of me saying, get your backsides in now, it's the equivalent of me saying, fine, don't come, you're not allowed to come in, stay out there. That's no strength at all. I sure showed them. It's a law which achieves nothing but to cover how weak he is. Secondly, they go even further and they make a law for the entire empire. A law that will be, quite frankly, impossible to enforce. I know, my lord. Let us also make a law that every man should be master in his own home. Let's ignore the fact that you couldn't do it, my lord. But let's make a law anyway. And thirdly, and this is the real cherry on the top for me, the edict that he makes actually undoes what he's trying to achieve. All it serves to do is to publicize to the whole empire, in every language, to every people group, the king's lack of authority in his own house. If it was meant to inspire respect for husbands and respect for the king, well, it's actually surely achieved the opposite. Well, Vashti didn't do what the king said. Why should I do what you said, love? The king can't even control his own wife. It's a wonder he can control the empire. Why publicize this event? You see, Vashti has shown that resistance is possible. It's not futile. And that assimilation to the will of the empire is not inevitable. Once again, at the same time as we are impressed by Ahasuerus' power and legal strength, we find it hard not to laugh as he slams this sledgehammer down on a nut and completely misses it. I kind of picture Ahasuerus waking up the next morning with, the king of all hangovers, and he looks over to his side of the bed and like, oh crumbs, where's Queen Vashti? And he looks at his writing desk with the wax still warm on his royal seal, and he begins to come back to him. What have I done? And Gerald! That's the butler in this situation. Gerald! Where's that decree I signed last night? Have you still got it? Oh no, my lord, I've already sent it out in the post. No! That's the situation here. What a numpty. This is the world in which God's people found themselves in. And often we still find ourselves in now, don't we? A world in which power is in the hands of the incompetent, and at best the amoral, and at worst the immoral. Many Christians throughout the world live in countries where real dictatorial governments reign, where life is dangerous, and where power and wisdom seldom go hand in hand. The reality of living with such people holding the power of life and death may seem to be no laughing matter, but sometimes laughter is the best way to respond, to mock, and to realize in our minds that these rulers are pathetic. They're not competent. They're just fools. Finally then, what do we learn from the opening chapter of Esther for our own walk in the world? Firstly, Esther chapter 1 reminds us not to take the power and glory of this world too seriously. Sometimes we do just have to laugh. The world takes itself all too seriously, doesn't it? And it wants us to take it seriously too. We live in a world that constantly elevates the trivial. Whole magazines are devoted to the antics of film, TV, and music stars. Our culture pays incredible amounts of money to grown men whose only talent is kicking a ball. And we think Ahasuerus was wasteful? We live in a world that considers our cars that we drive an extension of who we are. We live in a world that is more impressed by where we went to school than by what we learned there. And we think Ahasuerus' advisors were focused on trivialities. The empire of materialism in which we live wants us to take stuff desperately seriously. It wants us to care about what it cares about. It wants us to believe the things that it thinks is important. It wants us all to think and to believe the same thing. And if we disagree, well, what? That's the question. What really can they do? Our best defense against these powers is to laugh. To defend ourselves against the danger of being assimilated, we must learn to laugh at the empire in which we live. We must learn to laugh at those around us whose lives are wasted in pursuit of so many worthless goals. And this is really crucial, we must learn to laugh at ourselves. When we see our own hearts being weighed on the empire's scales of values, we have to see how foolish we are, how foolish we've been to be taken in by the world and its messages, and laugh at the things that we have begun to think are important. We need to check ourselves. When we see ourselves going the foolish way, we need to pull ourselves back. Don't take ourselves so seriously, but take God incredibly seriously. Secondly, Esther chapter 1 shows us that sometimes we just have to wait and see what God is doing. Esther and Mordecai, two characters we'll see later in the book of Esther, they've not even made an appearance yet here. But events are already moving according to God's good pleasure. Everyone we've seen so far in this story, every single one of them are pagans. They're not Jews. They're not God's people. And yet God is still moving things along. Even through these people, he's making preparations. I mean, we have to ask, humanly speaking, why did Vashti throw away her position and her privilege for a noble but predictably futile gesture? It didn't benefit her at all, did it? Why did the king make such a foolish demand on his wife in the first place? Who came up with the brilliant idea of making a big song and dance about replacing the queen instead of just dealing with it privately and quietly? On one level, all of these events are perfectly explainable as normal human events, with no miraculous components. Yet every single one of them is necessary to make way for Esther to come on the scene and use the power and influence she will be given to protect God's people against a powerful enemy. Spoiler alert. Coincidences? Of course not. God is at work. They are all the result of the work of the hand of God working in an entirely different mode to the way we see him working elsewhere in the Bible. Notice, though, and this is important, notice that none of these events would have seemed significant to the Jewish community in Susa at the time. They would not have seemed significant at all to them. Changing the queen? Who cares? Another stupid decree? So what? They could not have seemed more inconsequential, and yet they were of most importance. They were the steps God was taking to bring about his plan, working for the good of his people. So also in our own lives, we may have no idea what God is doing, but seemingly inconsequential, insignificant, even ridiculous events may and are being used by God for your good. Things are happening right now in your life which seem nothing, which seem even foolish, are being used by God for your good. He may seem hidden and remote, seemingly refusing to answer our prayers and give us what we earnestly desire. But wait. Wait on him. We must learn to wait. The end of our story has not been told yet. Who knows how the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that at present seem to have no logical connection with one another will ultimately come together for the good of those who love him. So laugh, be patient, and thirdly, know that God's kingdom is not like the kingdom of Ahasuerus. Know that God's kingdom is not like the kingdom of Ahasuerus. The book of Esther, and look for this theme as we go through as well, the book of Esther repeatedly invites us to compare and contrast the kingdom of God with the empire of Ahasuerus. There are superficial similarities between the two kingdoms, but there are greater and deeper differences. You see, the Lord God is also a great king whose decrees cannot be repealed. His sovereignty governs all things, from the large to the small. And he also must be obeyed, or we will certainly suffer the consequences. Yet, his law, God's law, is beneficial for men and women, unlike the drunken, self-important, power-grabbing decrees of the king of Persia. God doesn't use his people for his own purposes as if they were disposable commodities. Rather, he graciously invites us into a long-term relationship with himself. We begin this book here with a lavish banquet of the king that he invites his bride to. And we know that on the last day, God will prepare a lavish banquet for his people, and he will also call his bride to his banquets. But when God calls his bride to the banquets, when he calls the church to his banquet table, it will not be to expose her shame. It will not be to use her, but to lavish his grace and his mercy upon her. He doesn't force sinners to come unwillingly to his feast. He gently woos them and loves them and draws them to himself. Who then is your real king? To whom is your heart committed? The empire wants to make us a slave. It wants us to assimilate, to think the way it thinks, believe what it believes, and value what it values. Have we got trapped by that? It offers shiny prizes for those who will comply. A successful life by its own definition. Have we been enticed and trapped by that way of thinking? Flee from these things. Esther chapter 1 calls us to flee from these things. Flee to a kingdom that is solid and substantial. The kingdom that Jesus came to establish by his death on the cross. Learn to laugh at the emptiness of this world, at its edicts and power. Trust that God is at work, as he has promised you, working even through the evil impulses of the empire for good in our lives. Finally, remember that if you belong to Jesus, this empire, this power, is not your home. One day Jesus will return. The banquet will begin. So trust in him whilst we wait. Amen.